Good morning, art history, and welcome to Unit 2, the Ancient Mediterranean, Part 2, the Ancient Egyptians. Obviously, there's a great deal of significant and important historical context that we got to talk about in terms of the ancient Egyptians. The other thing I really want to talk about today is also the importance of geography in relationship to the ancient Egyptians. So, let's go ahead and just think through some of the major questions that I want you guys to be thinking about, the guiding questions. How does geography shape a culture's worldview? And of course, the major geography that most people think of when they think of ancient Egypt is the Nile River. But there's more to their geography than just the Nile River. We want to be thinking about the deserts that surround them, their access to vast quantities of limestone, also the cliffs and river valleys and sorts of things that are cut into the stone in like the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, as well as their access to the Mediterranean Sea and their ability to trade with a whole variety of different people as a result of their access to the Mediterranean Sea. Those are really, really important things to understand. How does a work of art and architecture reflect a historical and cultural context? And then how can we understand a structure by interpreting its plan? There's two things here that I want to add really quickly. One of those things is how do we think about power and authority in a society, in a culture, and how is it reflected in their art? How are power and authority reflected in their art? This is a concept that we talked about in the Sumerians. We're going to talk about it here again with the Egyptians. So power and authority. And then the other thing that is really important in this unit here is the concept of, or the idea of sacred spaces. Sacred spaces make up a great deal of really important and significant places in ancient Egypt. And so we want to know, like what are sacred spaces? How are they utilized in the cultural context? And what are the basic religious tenets of those people? So before we jump in, there's a few things that I feel like I really need to make sure that I write down. So in terms of just general background and context, let's talk about a few things in terms of general background or historical context. Number one, there's three major periods that we're going to look at. We're going to start with the Predynastic period. And the Predynastic period is around 3000 BCE ish. And the major piece that we're going to study when we look at that is the Palette of Narmer. The Palette of Narmer is associated with King Narmer, who was the sort of great uniter, who is considered to be this person of historical interest who united both the upper and lower portions of Egypt into one united kingdom, which brings us to the second major period of interest, which is what we call the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is this period in which most of what we know about ancient Egypt is really formally developed. They're building the Great Pyramids, and they are engaged in really interesting and complex religious worship. They have a king who's also a god, which we call a pharaoh, right? So this is the time in which those kings, as gods, would be worshipped by people, and ultimately they would be believed to become gods. Specifically, the pharaoh would be believed to become Horus upon death. And so that reincarnation, that cycle, was hugely significant for the people. Horus was the god of the sky. So the piece I want you guys to associate with this here is the Great Pyramids. And so thematically speaking, we can put some themes here. This here is, in the Predynastic period, is the theme is really unity. For the Great Pyramids, obviously tombs and the afterlife. The pyramids are essentially tombs. And oh my gosh, I put new here, but this is the Old Kingdom. I don't know why I did that. It's the Old Kingdom, 2500 BCE, Great Pyramids, tombs. The New Kingdom is actually a period that comes after a series of wars in what's called the Middle Kingdom, but the Middle Kingdom is really unimportant to us. We're going to just focus lastly on the New Kingdom, and the New Kingdom is a period in which Egypt was once again unified. We associate it with approximately somewhere around 1500 BCE, unified again by powerful pharaohs like Queen Hatshepsut and the builders of the Temple of Amun-Re, and also later kings like Akhenaten and his son Tutankhamun. If there's one piece that I really want you guys to be familiar with in the New Kingdom, it is probably the temples, and it would be the temples of Amun-Ra, sometimes called Amun-Re, and Hatshepsut. And so in this portion, the concept of the temple becomes really important. And I think it's worth sort of demonstrating that there's a difference here, right? The difference really is like, this is the worship of those who are passing, right? And this is the worship of gods as they currently exist. So those are some really important things to consider. Next, I want to kind of go a little bit more deeply into the context in terms of the geography, because the geography obviously plays a really important role. And it's one of our first essential questions that I really want to explore. How does geography shape a culture's worldview? So I'm going to draw a very weird map of Egypt. So to draw this map, I'm going to sort of imagine that we're floating up in space and just sort of hovering along the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean sort of hugs the upper portion of Egypt here, and then continues on towards places like Israel and up into the Middle East, right? And then as it moves this way, it moves to Algeria and various other places like that. And dumping out right about here is the Nile Delta. And of course, a delta is called a delta because it's in the shape of a triangle, right? And here the Nile Delta dumps into the Mediterranean and then slowly makes its way sort of actually upwards. I'm going to exaggerate. And the reason I want to exaggerate is because I want to be very clear about a few concepts. One is that when you move south, so again, this is moving into the north of Egypt, and then this is moving into the south of Egypt. When you move south, you're actually going up in elevation. So this is what we call Upper Egypt, because it goes up, because it's higher in elevation. And so the Nile Delta, where the Nile spills out and floods the plains, and allows for the fertility of the land and things like that. This is what we call Lower Egypt, because it's literally lower in terms of altitude, closer to sea level is another way to think about it. I think it's a really important map to kind of draw and think about, because a lot of what we need to know sort of fits within this. The other thing that I would point out, which I think is kind of important, is that you have deserts off in this direction. Perhaps I should use yellow. And this is actually where you have the major pyramids over here on this side. You actually have to go a little bit further south to get into like the Valley of the Queens and the Kings. But most of the settlements were actually on like the other bank, on the other side, on this side. So modern day Cairo sits opposite Giza. So if Giza is on this side of the river, which is where the pyramids are, then Cairo sits on the other side of the river largely. So there's some kind of historical context, and as we jump in here, we can talk about this first piece here, the Palette of Narmer, which of course is pre-dynastic, and you'll start to sort of see as we talk about this piece why all of those things are really important. So this is the Palette of King Narmer. It's from about 3000 BCE, and we know that this is King Narmer because of hieroglyphs. You guys know that hieroglyphs are the written language of the ancient Egyptians. So just like in the Sumerians and the Akkadians and in the ancient Near East, they utilized cuneiform. Here we have a written language. And so how do we know that this is the palette of Narmer? Because this hieroglyph right here is literally Narmer's name. It's the catfish with like this awl type thing that sits underneath it, or this wedge type thing that sits underneath it. And you'll see that it is repeated on the backside. So we've got the front side and the backside, sometimes called the obverse and the reverse, a term that comes from coinage. And then you'll also see the use of that same hieroglyph, which is Narmer's name right here. So we know that this large figure here is probably Narmer. So that brings us to some a good opportunity to kind of do some formal analysis and use some of the words that we know we see here. So just sort of zooming out, we see clear lines that sort of divide the different structure, the structure of the piece. And of course, these are registers. Those registers help us to read this and remind us that there's a sort of narrative structure to this. So the registers in this case are there to remind us that there's kind of a narrative structure, and we'll talk about that narrative structure. It's telling a story. So that's one. Two, we've got pictograms, in this case called hieroglyphs, and we see them in a lot of different places, telling us who different historical personages are. And we see them a lot. It's really cool because that means that you can literally read this. Which brings us to a word that I know that I've talked about before, iconography. Iconography is the study of images and the ability to read symbols and images and things like that. And what's really interesting is that being able to read hieroglyphs is kind of like a form of iconography, because you're basically reading a series of pictograms, a series of pictures, which is what we as art historians do, sort of writ large, or actually, I guess, small, and then that's what we do. Let's see, what other things should we point out? There's a clear sense, and many of you guys have probably already saw this, a clear sense of hieratic scale. Narmer, in particularly, is heads taller than everybody else. So you've got his one of his priestesses is Sandalbearer here, who's tiny by comparison. You have the person he's conquering, who's actually rather large, but is down on his knees. Over here in this depiction of Narmer, we have a really obvious example of hieratic scale. You'll also notice that, kind of like what you saw with the Sumerians, you have what we call a composite pose. And a composite pose is basically taking the elements of the frontal and side view of someone and choosing different parts of each based on what you think is most characteristic of that person. So if we look at, and this is a good one to remember, if we look at the composite pose of Narmer, the legs are in profile, meaning that we're looking at the side of them. We're looking at the side of the legs as they sort of move this way. But the torso is frontal. So this is profile, right? And this is frontal. I don't know if you guys can read that. The head is profile, but the eye is facing front. And so it's all these really interesting choices about how you take elements of the side of someone and then elements of the front of someone and then compose them together in this sort of mixed up way, based on what you think is the most identifiable way of identifying them. Interestingly enough, we know that ancient Egyptian artists were actually trained in this language of composite pose. We've found objects like this that are unfinished. And what's really interesting is that when they're unfinished, you'll actually see incised over the entire thing, you'll see a series of grids. And that gridded structure basically ensures that, and I think that in the Old Kingdom, they use the size of a fist right here to basically measure out everything else, so that there's a very, very, very formal language. And when I say formal in this case, I mean that it's like very specific. And when you have this formal language that is very specific to a particular group of people, that's what we call a style. That's what we call a style. And so these images are what we might say stylized. They utilize a very specific style associated with ancient Egypt that utilizes things like composite pose, hieratic scale, and things like that. There's a lot of different formal analysis that we can do here. I would just point out one other thing that we're going to kind of talk about this later, but there's this really cool idea in ancient Egypt where artists and architects they were priests. Artists and architects were essentially priests, or they worked for priests, and they had the responsibility of ensuring the afterlife of the people they portrayed. And it was believed that it was only through following this very formal language that we just discussed that they could actually preserve what they called the Ka. So if you guys remember, I introduced this idea of, whenever you talk about form, the formal language of something, you often want to be able to link it to content. So in this case, if we talk about the idea of, hey, they have this very specific style, what does that mean? Well, what it means in this particular case is that it is a tool that is linked to preserving the Ka. And the Ka is the soul or the spirit of the person. And so when we look at Narmer is in this very, very, very structured pose, but the person that he's defeating is not. And that's because they're not interested in preserving the Ka of this person. These people down here are also not in that very formal pose because they're not interested in preserving the Ka of that person. And so the most structured person on this entire thing is Narmer. And you'll notice that it's the same thing over here. He's very, very sort of formally posed. Lot going on in this image, isn't there? So that's just like, that all just sort of takes up the formal elements. Let's talk about some of the content. The content here is really a series of different scaled pictograms. So we can talk about the pictograms on the smallest scale, which are here, all of the hieroglyphs. So on one level, you can read this as the written word through the use of hieroglyphs, which are a form of pictograms. But then if we sort of bump up one level, there's actually like stylized symbols or iconography that we see throughout the image. So for example, this image right here of the lion's head sort of twisting and uniting here, this is a clear symbol that is meant to sort of signify the idea of unity. And I said before that the Predynastic period is all about this concept of unity, and specifically unifying Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. We also see a very sort of large pictogram here. It's really fascinating. And it doesn't seem to serve any other larger purpose within the narrative structure of Narmer, like bashing this guy's brains in. It's just sort of floating there off to the side, which is really interesting. And so we understand it to be a sort of complex pictogram or set of symbols that a person at the time would have been able to read clearly. We know that this is a falcon, and we know that whenever we see a falcon, that it's the god Horus. To reinforce that, Horus actually has arms here, and he's using one of his arms with his pick to go up into the nose of this person who he's conquered, and that person looks a lot like this person down here. Right? So this person right here, because of the similarity here, may actually represent someone from Lower Egypt. So the hairstyle and things like that may actually represent someone from Lower Egypt. What makes us think that represents someone from Lower Egypt? Well, there's a couple other reasons. One, we have pictograms that may indicate that they're from Lower Egypt. But two, we also have papyrus leaves here. And papyrus grows in Lower Egypt. It grows in the flooded regions of the Nile Delta, and it grows literally in the water. And so this pictogram here of papyrus is probably a hieroglyph that means Lower Egypt. And so we have Horus on top of Lower Egypt, shoving this thing up this guy's nose. We also know that this tool was utilized by ancient Egyptians in the mummification process. They would shove this up through their nose, break through the bone just behind the eyes and the nose. Sometimes they'd go directly through the eye. And they would swirl it around to liquefy your brain, and then your brain would leak out your nose. And that would ensure that all of the brain material didn't rot inside of your head, ruining the possibility of the mummification process. And then they would shove natron, which is a salt and things like that, up into these the recesses and stuff, and the salt would prevent any bacteria from forming, which would ensure the mummification process. So here they seem to have like almost like they are conquering and mummifying the Lower Egyptian king, but then standing on top of Lower Egypt. This is Horus. Horus has a clear connection with Narmer because as we go through, we're going to find out that pharaohs, which are early god kings, were believed to be the incarnation of the god Horus. So in this case, what we see here is we actually see an image of Horus who can be interpreted as Narmer actually conquering Lower Egypt, which then is replayed out right next to it as we see Narmer with the club, literally about to bash in the brains of this guy from Lower Egypt. Interestingly enough, we see another pictogram down here. This one includes a bull, and this bull is riding into a city and knocking down the city walls and trampling more Lower Egyptians down here. Now, interestingly enough, you'll notice something. If you look at the bull, it's very stylized in its portrayal, but it's got this very distinct tail that sort of runs between its legs right here. I don't know if you guys can see that. I hope you can. I'm trying to circle it right there. But if you look at that tail, what's really fascinating is if you look at Narmer, Narmer has that exact same tail here, and he has that exact same tail here. And so what that tells us is that Narmer is the bull that has sort of knocked down the city walls. And so once again, we have this depiction here in pictogram form of Narmer conquering and engaging in conquest, which so that same image gets replayed out several different times. It also gets sort of replayed out here. This one's an interesting one because you'll notice here Narmer is wearing what we call the white crown of Upper Egypt. And people would have known him. He would have worn that crown. And so people in Upper Egypt would have known him, for wearing that crown. And so what's fascinating is over here, he's wearing a different crown. And this is the red crown of Lower Egypt. And so because he's wearing a crown that might be unfamiliar to people who would see this, they actually put his name next to it so that people know, oh yeah, this is Narmer. He's just wearing a different crown, right? Later on, you'll see that in the Old Kingdom, those two crowns become unified into a single crown. And become symbols of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. By putting Narmer on the opposite side, wearing the crown of the Lower Egyptian king, it's sort of like reinforcing this idea that he now controls both. And of course, his soldiers are parading all of these things in front of the dead here, who've had their heads sliced off and stuck between their legs, which is really fascinating and interesting, the way in which he's parading, to see the dead. It turns out that this object would have been a small object that sits in the palm of your hand. And I'm moving here now to function. What was the purpose of this? Well, it would have held eye makeup, and you would have probably put some kind of black makeup here that would have been probably like an eyeliner. We know that Egyptians use eyeliner to sort of highlight the eyes to make them stand out, but probably also to protect from sun and things like that. Because the black doesn't reflect, right? It doesn't reflect light; it absorbs light, and so it might allow you to see better. Which might also be why football players put black on their cheekbones and things like that. So this is an incredibly wonderfully complex image that clearly indicates that in the pre-dynastic period, in around 3000, there's already this very complex language, complex religion, complex system of beliefs. And a very sort of like stylized set of beliefs. And as we move into the Old Kingdom, we're just going to see that language ends up being utilized again and again and again. Obviously, we won't see that specific language in the pyramids themselves, but we will see them in other places inside of the pyramids. For example, we'll see composite pose paintings on the walls of the pyramids and things like that. But the one thing that we can say that sort of reminds us, about Narmer is that, this is an image of power. This is an image that sort of tells us about power and authority, right? And the power and authority of Narmer, as well as his sort of godlike status, like playing out this sort of image of Horus over here, conquering the city or conquering the Lower Egyptians. And that's something that remains the same as we move from the pre-dynastic into the Old Kingdom. The pharaohs are becoming incredibly powerful. They are god kings. They're not just kings like when we saw in Sumeria where they had a close relationship with the god. They're actually gods. And so the idea of being able to get large quantities of workers to support you in the building of a massive structure like this, well, it was an honor because, a lot of people think that the Egyptians used slaves, but the fact of the matter is that if the Egyptians believed in their religion wholeheartedly, the ability to work directly for a god was something that was a distinct privilege. And they paid them well, typically in grains and beer and things like that. So what we actually see here, this is actually the largest pyramid back here. It's just further back in the distance. And it actually goes in almost chronological order. This is the pyramid of Khufu back here, Khafre in the middle, and Menkaure down here. You can always tell Menkaure is because he's got his 3 wives sitting in the front. There's another one off to the side here, 3 smaller pyramids off to the side. That's that. You can also tell that they're sandstones stacked up, and that there would have been a veneer. We talked about this word before. A veneer is a thin facade or a thin layer of sanded down marble. Not in this case, I'm sorry, limestone that would have been sort of applied to the surface to actually make these smooth. The other thing that we're missing here in terms of the context is there would have been something we call, or that the Egyptians called a benben. And the benben is basically a small pyramid that is covered in gold, probably thin gold leaf. And it would have sat right on top of here. And so you would have at the top of each of these pyramids had this sort of gleaming triangle sitting on top. If you ever go up on top of one of these pyramids, it's illegal to do so, but people have done it. You can look it up on YouTube. It's actually a fairly large flat area on top. These things are so big they look pointed, but when you get up to the top, it's actually fairly flat. You can kind of walk around on it. And that's because this structure of the benben is missing. That's what would have been sort of like the gleaming point at the top of these things. Now, we also know that these are tombs, and so there would have been passages that go underneath for all of these things, which is where the king's chamber and the queen's chamber would have been underneath these things. The other thing that might be worth noting is, we've got Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Khufu's is the biggest. It's the middle one, Khafre, that's connected to the Sphinx. And the Sphinx, I feel like I should write this in red. The Sphinx is that very large lion-looking thing with the head of a man, and it's actually the head of Khafre. So you can see that here as you go from Khufu's here to Khafre's to Menkaure's, going from the largest to the middle one to the smallest one with the 3 little baby pyramids of his wives. And then you'll see the main causeway here that would have attached to the Sphinx. This is what we might call a necropolis, which is a city of the dead. These are Greek words, necropolis, but we utilize them for the sake of this. And there would have been other burial sites. There would have been administrative buildings and all sorts of things like that for people to be buried in, as well, so that they can continue to serve the pharaoh even after death. Interestingly enough, historians believe that these 3 pyramids are actually aligned to stars in Orion's belt. If you've ever seen Orion, which is really fascinating and may have something to do with connections between cosmology. There's another really cool thing, which I told you before, that the river is actually the river would be. I'm trying to orient myself properly. There's a great view. Like, it's hard to see now, but the river would have been off in the distance, the Nile River, and the people would have lived typically on the other side of the river, and so they would be able to see these just beyond the river. And so what's really interesting is that in Egyptian mythology, there was this idea that you had the primordial waters, which were the river Nile, right? The Nile River gave life to everything else. And what the reason why it gave life to everything else is they believe that there was the primordial waters of the Nile, and then the first ray of light rose from the primordial waters, and the mixture of that first ray of light coupled with the water would give life to everything. And the first ray of light they actually called the benben. And they formulated it in the form of a triangle. And so this image, this concept of the first ray of light rising up from the waters that give life to all things, is a really interesting idea. By the way, Horus is the god of the sky. We know the sun goes up into the sky. The sun god is a different god, but it's just a really cool idea to sort of imagine that if you were standing on the far side of the Nile River, if you were standing on the far side of the Nile River, like where modern day Cairo is today, and you looked across before all of the buildings and stuff were built, if you looked across the Nile at the time in which these were built, you would have seen these massive pyramids off in the distance with that gleaming benben on top. And it would have been in some way a sort of physical recreation of your creation story, of your religious creation story, which is a really cool, sort of very fascinating idea. here you can sort of get into the sort of complexities of these things. The galleries oftentimes would incorporate paintings. And again, the paintings would be very strictly stylized. And the idea was that if you had a mummified body, if you had a granite statue of the king and the queen, if you had all of these galleries of these different paintings, and then you buried them with things that they had in life, then the ka, the soul, would actually be able to inhabit the paintings. If they were painted correctly, they would be able to inhabit the mummy. If it was mummified properly, it would be able to inhabit the statue of them, the granite statue of them, or gray whack or whatever hard stone they were using. And then it would be able to survive forever in this place and be able to go through each of those different pictures. Like they'd be able to hunt um, hippos and things like that, which hippos were a symbolic representation of evil. And so they would actually paint pharaohs hunting hippos to sort of like symbolically capture the notion of Horus and Pharaoh banishing evil from the realm of life, which is the Nile River, which is so many sort of really cool ideas. Then you also notice that they have these shafts here. And we think that those shafts, some people thought that they were air shafts. Probably not. What they were probably used for was they probably were according to the solstice, and they probably were for the ka to be able to escape and rise up into the heavens and things like that when necessary. So really, really, really interesting, cool stuff. Here you can see some cuttings, the way they would have like originally had these finished. So these would have been smooth. By the Middle Kingdom in ancient Egypt, so this is Old Kingdom around 2500 BCE. By the Middle Kingdom, there were already grave robbers digging down and robbing these places and things like that. So it didn't take modern people in the 1920s to rob these things. Many of these things had already been robbed. Just FYI, I think it's kind of interesting to point that out. Here are some of the major statues. This is a statue of Menkaure and one of his wives. This is his favorite wife. I know that he has 3 other wives. This is Menkaure and Khmer Nebti, his wife. And it's so interesting to sort of compare a statue in ancient Egypt to a statue in ancient Greece or a statue in, well, especially ancient Greece, but especially like, also like the Sumerians. Because you can see just by looking at the statue that the material and the way they've sculpted it, what they're interested in more than anything else is durability. They're interested in a statue that is going to last forever. And you know that because they are unwilling to carve, interesting details in the hands. They leave the material in the hands, the material between. So the negative space is actually still part of the statue. They create these sort of curvilinear geometric forms in the hair because they don't want to make it too detailed, because then they could fall apart and break off and things like that. And so you can sort of tell by the way that they've made this sculpture that it's really about preservation. I'm going to go ahead and stop here and just sort of like wrap up. That's most of the Old Kingdom stuff. I'll give you one quick comparison. This is a seated scribe. The seated scribe is probably a wooden core with a plaster layer and then painted. You'll notice that he's not idealized. So like when we look at these pharaohs, a lot of these pharaohs would be buried with these statues. And this is not at all what they look like when they died. They probably look significantly older. And so what we have here is very much an idealized portrayal. And of course you would idealize. Idealize means to look perfect. You have this idealized portrayal because the ka, the soul, is then going to inhabit this. And you don't want them to inhabit their old, frail body. You want them to inhabit this sort of perfect version of themselves. By comparison, you often find these statues of people like scribes. This is a seated scribe. And these scribes, very much like the votive figures that we saw in the ancient Near East, would sort of have these eyes that sort of stare at you very, very naturalistically and very realistically, as they sort of write down all of the words that the ka of the pharaoh might say in the afterlife. And what's so interesting is they're painted, they're naturalistic. And when I say naturalistic, I mean that the body looks more like it does in actual nature and it's not idealized. You might also use the word realistic to say kind of the same thing, right? Whether it's the painting or whether it's the slight pudginess of the belly. There's just things here that are clearly naturalistic. The glass insides of the eyes to make it more realistic. And that's because if we go back to that whole concept that we talked about when we talked about Narmer, they're not interested in the preservation of their ka. they're interested in having these people be attentive to the pharaoh. Um, and if they were more interested in preserving the ka, they would have made this out of a harder stone. They would have followed the same idealized proportions that they utilized for the pharaohs. So it's really interesting. It's probably the opposite of the way we think of things today in our culture. We would probably think that if someone spends time making someone look more naturalistic or more realistic, it's because they're more important. And if we made them more abstracted and simplified, or like with a lack of detail, like these statues here, that they're actually less important. But in fact, in ancient Egypt and the Old Kingdom, it was the reverse. You were more important if you look this way because they were more interested in preserving your soul. They're also using materials here that will not stand the test of time, which is sort of a testament to the idea that they're not as interested in the preservation of those objects, which is really fascinating. I think it's so interesting. So that's the pre-dynastic and the Old Kingdom. We're gonna have to save the New Kingdom for another time, where we tend to look at temples and things like that. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up there. I hope that helps. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and you'll have to let me know.